Hey, welcome to the channel, Mr. Gunn. Can I call you James? Mr. Gunn feels very formal. Regardless, I was thrilled when I heard that you were taking control of the DCEU. God knows they needed to change a pace, and I think you might be just the right man for the job. I admit, though, I was shocked when you reached out to me to write a plan for a brand new DCEU. I don't know that I'm qualified for it, but don't worry. I took it very seriously. I've dressed for the occasion, and as usual, I've done my research. I studied criminology, psychology, mythology, writing, theory, anything and everything that I thought would be even remotely relevant. And I now have prepared for you 3 full phases of DC films and television programs that, if executed correctly, will make the MCU look like Kingdom Hearts. But before we can get into all of that, I need to explain to you why the poor attempt that your predecessors made failed, so that we can avoid making the same mistakes that they did. And don't worry, even though I've uploaded this video to YouTube, I'll keep it private so it's just between you and me. And in order to maintain the highest degree of professionalism, I have organized my thoughts into the most formal kind of presentation, a PowerPoint. So let's get into it. One of the major problems that your predecessors have is that they never seemed to really understand the characters that they were using. Here's some examples, right? First of all, they turned Batman into a murderer. And I know that there's some people who are okay with that, but it's not just a situation in which he had to kill somebody once, made a tough decision. No, this Batman shoots people, he blows people up, he runs them over with his car, and generally he doesn't even particularly seem to feel bad about it. He's honestly a worse villain than the villains that we've seen him fight. So I don't know that this is necessarily what you want for your Batman to be. He comes across more as like an Elseworlds Batman or like a Thomas Wayne Batman. It's just not what we were looking for. Second of all, Superman is this really grim, disinterested Jesus allegory, and that's just very much not who Superman is, right? Superman is supposed to be this beacon of hope, right? He's called the Boy Scout, right? He's a bright and shining, very classically heroic person, and yet so many of the shots that we see him in his movies, he looks like there's that one shot where he looks really sour, where he's like dragging that boat behind him, and he looks like, oh, I can't believe mom's making me help the boat guys again. Like, he looks like he doesn't want to be there. And also, making him a Jesus allegory is, first of all, not original. A lot of people want to pretend that the DC superheroes are like gods, which I don't think is a good direction to go with them. And also, if you start in the first film by making your main character Jesus, there's just not a whole lot of room for upward mobility until you just make him a god. And, well, you guys got to that really fast too. So it wasn't a good idea. And third, Wonder Woman has been made into just a moron, right? And she beat her primary villain in her first movie with the power of love, which is just ludicrous for one. And to be fair, I did think the first Wonder Woman movie was probably one of the more successful movies that your predecessors put out. But how come when she went to London, or was it New York? I think it was London. How come she still felt the need to walk down the street with her sword and shield out and in her hands, right? Surely, as an intelligent warrior, she could look around and see that these other people are not currently in battle, and at minimum put the sword in its sheath or something, right? Not to mention the fact that she couldn't figure out how a rotating door worked. It's just, she's very stupid, and not in an endearing way either. And this is problematic because this is the Trinity, right? These are the three most important characters in any DC universe, and they are a murderer, Jesus, and a moron. There's just not a lot we can do with that, right? And this is not an isolated thing, right? These are not the only characters who have been misused or poorly written, right? We, of course, had the Joker, who I don't even think I really need to explain why he was a train wreck. I think even if he had been cast as somebody who wasn't insane, I don't think anyone could have taken the writing that this Joker was given and made it even remotely tolerable. We also had, of course, Lex Luthor, who honestly did a better job of being the Joker than the guy you had as the Joker, but either way, was nowhere near the Lex Luthor that he should have been. We also had Cheetah, so three really big villains just completely done dirty. Not only was she made to be very weak and like just not interesting for the majority of her movie, but when she did finally turn into the Cheetah proper, well, she looked like this. So there just wasn't a whole lot of ability for people to care about her or anything she was doing. Then you, of course, have Cassandra Cain, who was really only Cassandra Cain in name. I don't know if you're familiar with the character, but, well, it's not this one. This is... this was a mistake, and I'm not sure how this one made it past any level of thought process. We also had Black Mask, who, granted, him being done particularly bad might have been able to have been gotten away with on account of the fact that there's not a whole lot of Black Mask fans, with the exception of, well, me. But I just wanted to especially point out that that's not who Black Mask is. That's completely wrong, and quite possibly the worst example of this is Pa Kent. I don't think there was a single good line that this man was given. He was not Pa Kent. This was a bad idea, right? Pa Kent is supposed to be this rock, right, for Superman, who he's supposed to be able to lean on and sort of get his moral, understanding from. And this Pa Kent was anything but that. And these are just a couple of the ones that I pulled out. Really, genuinely, there are so few characters in the DCEU who I feel were done correctly. This list could be 10 slides in and of itself, but I don't think either of us want to sit through that. So we'll move on to the next major problem, which is, of course, just a really strange over-reliance on bad CG, right? Of course, we had Doomsday, who somehow looked worse than Peter Jackson's cave trolls, despite the fact that he had about 10 years of technology to his advantage. We had this situation with Superman's mustache. Of course, I understand that there were extenuating circumstances for this one, but your Warner Brothers, he was going off to be in a Mission Impossible movie, and not even as a main character. If you have an actor who's playing Superman, one of the most recognizable characters of all time, I think that you have the high ground to say, no, he's gonna shave that mustache, especially because it's so much easier to put on a fake mustache than to digitally remove a real mustache. It just didn't look good. I mean, in every scene in which it was a digital upper lip, it made it look like he was slowly transforming into a monster, and I don't think that was the vibe you were going for. We, of course, had just the majority of Aquaman. This particular scene, I barely remember. I'm not sure what had caused it or why any of that had been happening. I tried to rewatch it recently and could not see what was happening in this scene. It felt very unusual and just generally looked really bad. We, of course, had Wonder Woman 84's big dumb gold bird suit. I understand that this is a thing from the comics, but there were better ways to do this, and I feel like you knew that it wasn't a good idea too, or your predecessors, I should say, because she took the wings off very quickly. So it just wasn't. There wasn't a whole lot of follow through on this poor decision. There was, of course, Olive Enchantress, just Olive Enchantress. Why did she move like that? Why did she move like that? Cyborg. There's so many better examples of what Cyborg's machine parts could look like, and I understand that they wanted it to look like it was weird alien technology because it was made from a mother box, but I feel like even then you could have probably done a practical face piece and it would have at least made it look like the actor was actually on set, and I feel like that would have helped. And of course, the Flash. Why every time he runs does shoot lightning? And why does he run like that? Is that an Ezra Miller thing? I don't know if that's CG or if he's just an idiot. I feel like recent events leads me to believe that it's more the second one. But why the lightning? That's such a strange choice. It's regardless. And if you think that this is something that is no longer the case, that has been corrected, let me remind you that in the most recent DC movie, we of course had Sabak, who looked like a PS3 Mortal Kombat background character. If you're gonna do CG, just make sure it doesn't look like this. You know what I mean? Like, there are a lot of these things that we could have done practically or just not done. Because frankly, a lot of this stuff would have been better to just not have been in the movie at all. So this has been a really big problem for the DCEU that I think we can fix quite easily. The next major problem is everything is an ensemble, and I know what you're thinking. Daniel, you're over-exaggerating. There's not that many ensembles, really? Here, check this out. Batman vs. Superman, Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, Justice League, Shazam, Birds of Prey, The Suicide Squad, and Black Adam. The problem is not that there's so many ensembles necessarily. The problem is that almost none of these characters were set up in prior movies. So in every single one of these films, you just throw all these characters at people and expect them to be able to be appreciated and empathized with by an audience who's only known them for like 10 minutes. And it doesn't work, right? There's just not enough time in a single film to do justice to, I mean, like in the Suicide Squad, there's like 10 villains. There was no way that you were going to be able to do justice to 10 different villains, right? You, Mr. Gunn, did the Suicide Squad and did a much better job with it because you at least knew that if you're going to cast that many people, you're not going to be able to focus on the majority of them, and just completely wrote off about 2/3 of the cast very early on to set the stage for how serious what the Suicide Squad's job was. And that worked very well. And then the ones that you actually kept as characters, you did a great job of working through. And, you know, there are examples of this working. I think the Suicide Squad and the first Wonder Woman, of course, did a perfectly fine job with their ensembles. But as a trend, it doesn't work. I mean, as an example, if anyone can, without looking it up, tell me the names of the other 5 Shazam kids, I will give you 10 points. I don't know what those points are good for, but we'll figure it out. I genuinely would be shocked if anyone could. Another major problem is that in the writing, we just go way too big too fast. And let me explain what that means. In the first movie, Man of Steel, Superman goes from being a small town farm boy to fighting a terraforming skybeam in 2 hours. That's a lot to ask for the audience to follow with, right? We're still trying to like relate to this character, and before we have a chance to even really get to know who he is, he's punching a giant terraforming machine above the Pacific Ocean, right? It's a lot to ask, right? And then in that same movie, the reason he's doing that is because Metropolis is being invaded by an army of Kryptonians, right? And it's just a lot for the first movie, right? We need to ramp up so that we still have room for escalation in later films. If you start with some of the most powerful people in the universe showing up and destroying a city and trying to terraform the planet in literally film one, you don't really leave yourself a whole lot of room for escalation, and that became a big problem for the DCEU. In film two, for example, we already had to have the entire Trinity and Doomsday in order to try and top that invasion, right? And as a result of that, neither Batman and especially not Wonder Woman had any real level of like build up to their existence, right? I'm relatively confident that in Batman vs Superman, Wonder Woman just kind of shows up. I think she just like is at that party. It's a very strange way to introduce probably one of the most important characters in the entire DC universe. It was certainly a choice, and that same film was also the death of Superman, which is one of the most important and popular comics of all time, and you guys did it in film 2. That's not... y'all really just went sprinting for it. I do appreciate you at least showing that one on camera, because you did Death in the Family off screen, which I feel like could have been a really good movie if you had made it, but instead you just decided that it was not something that we needed to see. And also in film 2, because we didn't have a lot of time to build up Batman, we had to show his entire progression from being a child and watching his parents die all the way to fighting Superman in like 2 hours, while also trying to introduce, Doomsday and Wonder Woman and all these other characters, and it was just a lot to ask to work out, and it didn't as a response. This might feel like a cop-out to say, also, you guys just had some really bad writing, but you did, right? For example, I already talked a little bit about Pa Kent, but the part after Clark has saved that bus full of kids and he asks his dad, what should I have done? Let them die? And his dad's basically just like, yeah, man, fuck those kids. Like, that was not a good idea, right? That's not Pa Kent. That's not Superman. It was poor writing, and it wasn't particularly well done. And no disrespect to the actors, I think all of the actors involved in honestly, most of the actors are good actors. They're just not given good lines to work with or anything of interest to say. So that was an awful moment. I feel like I don't need to bring up the Martha moment. It's been memed to death. I understand. I recently found out that the reason that Martha moment existed in Batman vs. Superman was because originally Snyder wanted for Martha Wayne and Martha Kent to be the same person. And so that weird, which was a terrible idea, but so that weird Martha scene was like a artifact from a script that didn't end up making the final cut. But like, hey, if you cut the plot point that makes that scene make sense, maybe also cut that scene, because it doesn't make sense. You know what I mean? Also, while we're just all of Batman Superman, just while we're on the topic, I don't think anything was particularly interesting or well written in Batman Superman. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about why that movie was such a colossal train wreck, because there's thousands and thousands of videos on YouTube that already do that. So I feel like I don't really need to in that case. And the same is true for all of Wonder Woman 84. I mean, there's some really talented people in that movie. Pedro Pascal has recently proven himself to be an outstanding actor. I even think Kristen Wiig, although she gets a lot of disrespect, I think she's a really good actress. But the writing of that movie, there was just nothing they could do with it. I mean, Pedro Pascal spends the ending of that movie standing in a blue sky beam and yelling "granted" for what felt like, I'm sure it wasn't, but what felt like 30 minutes. There's just no actor could have made that not stupid. So it was very strange. Also, this is sort of a nitpick, but in this universe, how does no one know who Wonder Woman or Superman are, right? Because in Batman and Superman, Wonder Woman says that she laid low and like hid herself, but then in '84 we see that she saved the world and was very public. She was like stealing jets and going on television and like talking to literally the entire planet in their brains because of weird military technology. It's not what I would call laying low. I think the fact that Batman had to look up who she was at all doesn't really make a lot of sense. And Superman, in his movie, in Man of Steel, the Kryptonians land in Smallville, have a fight at the Kent farm, and then fight a man who looks suspiciously like Clark Kent in Smallville, and then also in Metropolis, where Clark Kent works. There's a level of, disbelief that I'm willing to suspend, right? Because, like, in the real world, you would look at somebody like Henry Cavill or Gal Gadot, and you would say, these are the most gorgeous human beings that exist on the planet Earth. And you would know immediately whether or not they were wearing glasses or whatever Wonder Woman does to try and hide her identity. You would already know that that was Superman because he's gorgeous and Wonder Woman is like the most beautiful thing on the planet. So like you would recognize them, right? And I'm willing to suspend the disbelief on that, but you gotta at least give me something to help me out with that. You can't have Zod show up at the Kent farm and then fight Superman in Smallville on television. Like, it's a lot. It's a lot to ask the audience. While we're on the topic of things that just it didn't really make a whole lot of sense, what was Aquaman even about? I've watched this movie recently. I rewatched it in preparation for this, and I still cannot grasp what the plot of this movie was, genuinely. I remember all the pieces individually. I cannot tell you how or why they fit together in the way they do. I don't understand. Why did they go to the desert? It was like a lost civilization from Atlantis that was not underwater anymore, but it used to be underwater. Very strange. Don't understand it. And then in the most recent film, Black Adam, they just kind of dropped an Army of the Dead in at the end with very little, if any, setup. And then the Army of the Dead really didn't do anything other than give us one really funny joke, which admittedly was a high point of the movie for me. But it didn't make it good. And so while it might be a hard or just kind of broad thing to say that the DC films just have bad writing, they do. And we're going to have to work through that. One last thing. The Superman resurrection in Justice League was also another one of these examples of things that just didn't really make a whole lot of sense. It just felt very contrived. Much like the plot of Aquaman, it just didn't make a lot of sense. And this is something that is reoccurred through all of these movies. Another big issue, and we touched on it earlier, is just really bad casting and also misusing very good actors and even actors who are put in very fitting roles are just not given anything to work with, right? So some examples of the bad casting are, of course, Jared Leto. I feel like I don't need to go into that. Everyone knows he's insane. I don't think that he's ever been in anything that he did well in. And like, hey, if you know that an actor like sends severed pig heads or whatever it was to people in the mail, then like, don't hire that guy. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but don't hire that guy. Jesse Eisenberg, good actor. We know he's a good actor. I don't know what the hell happened with Lex Luthor, but he is not proving it there, right? He did not know what character he was playing, and somebody should have explained it to him. Gal Gadot looks the part, right? looks like Wonder Woman. She's gorgeous. She's got the accent. She looks like Wonder Woman, but she, I'm sorry, cannot act. She's just not good at it. Ezra Miller. I understand that we didn't know that he was a criminal at the time that you cast him. However, I would argue that we should have known he's just not a good actor on account of he's never been a good actor in anything that he's ever been in. And so we could have really avoided this issue by just casting a good actor for one of our major Justice League members. I don't know. It's just a thought. Jason Momoa kind of falls into a similar situation as Gal Gadot, where he does look the part, at least well enough. You know, he's not a white blonde guy, but like, whatever. Make Aquaman a Samoan. It fits. It feels that no problem with. Felt great, and he's gorgeous. Everyone knows it. Jason Momoa puts butts in seats. I understand it, but he's not a good actor. I understand that he got a lot of fame from Game of Thrones, but let's keep in mind that in Game of Thrones, all he ever did was grunt and or hump, which is not exactly a particularly wide tool set to be, again, one of our major Justice League members. Amber Heard is kind of the same thing as Ezra Miller, right? We knew, or we didn't know that she was a criminal at the time, but we did know that she was terrible. So she shouldn't have probably gotten cast as Mira. And The Rock, I know, hold on, I know, there's people who are going to be very upset that I've put The Rock on this list. However, while I think that The Rock is probably a lot of fun and definitely sold a lot of tickets for that movie on his name alone, he was not Black Adam in that movie. He was just The Rock, because that's what he is in every single movie that he has ever been in, is he just plays The Rock. He's not an actor. He is a character in and of himself. And that doesn't really work when you want him to be in your movie, unless you want him to be The Rock in that movie. You see what I'm saying? Also, the fact that he's got that really weird egotistical thing going on where he like refuses to lose or look weak in any of his movies, we could have done better. I understand that he looks the part and that he sells tickets, but like, there's not really a lot of longevity in that. He just wasn't the right choice. Something that's just one step down in terms of poor choices is some of the actors who have been misused, right? For example, I think Henry Cavill is a wonderful Superman. He looks the part. You ever watch him in interviews, he's amazing, right? He is Superman embodied. The fact that he, while filming Man of Steel, refused to take steroids because he felt that it would have been cheating, and he also refused, for the same reason, to let them digitally touch him up, like to make him look buffer. That's exactly the kind of attitude that a man who is Superman would have, right? He's perfect casting, and yet the script and the direction just completely failed him. And the same can be said for Ben Affleck. I know that some people are really down on him, but I actually think he could have been a very good Batman if the direction and the scripts hadn't driven him to hate the fact that he was Batman. Like, that's so depressing that somebody got cast as one of the most popular characters of all time, and because of how terrible the movie he was in was, it led him to just crushing depression. Like, that's awful. That's just really, really awful. Will Smith, kind of the same thing. Granted, I wouldn't cast him now, because I think he might be psychotic, but he made a good Deadshot. Right? There was some interesting things going on there. This was one issue where it was like one good character in a really bad movie, where like if he had been surrounded by a better situation, I really do think that Will Smith's Deadshot could have been great. Viola Davis is the same thing. We know Viola Davis is an amazing actress, and I think she's a really good casting choice for Amanda Waller. But if you write her like that, it's not going to work, right? Pedro Pascal, we already talked about. Ewan McGregor's Black Mask, that one's really just for me, but he's an amazing actor. But when you tell him to play the different, when you tell him to play a character in a way that is in no way faithful to that character, it's just not going to feel right, right? For people who know who that character is. Now, there have, however, been some breakout stars, and I want to give you guys the flowers that you deserve. One of those is Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn. Is she the perfect Harley Quinn? No, of course not, right? I know this is sort of a controversial thing, but there's no arguing that she is probably the most popular thing to have come out of the DCEU in terms of merch, in terms of sales, in terms of just not knowing that she was actually a really good actress, and then it turned out that she was. She is the person who has made the most out of her time in the DCEU, and she needs to be given the flowers for that. Also, I do genuinely think that she is or could be an amazing Harley Quinn, right? She understands the role. She maybe can't do the voice, but we can do without it. It's not the end of the world. Another one, Zachary Levi's Shazam. I think he did fantastic. He really has that like youthful zeal to him, right? He obviously looks the part. I think he was fantastic. Idris Elba is good in everything. I've never seen a movie with Idris Elba in it and not been happy with his performance in it, right? I'm sure that he's been in bad movies, but he wasn't the reason why those movies were bad. So give him his flowers. And weirdly, and I wasn't expecting to put him on this side of the list, but John Cena. He has a similar problem that The Rock has, where he just kind of plays John Cena. But if you cast John Cena as Peacemaker, it works. He fits that role very well, right? He worked extremely well in the Suicide Squad, so much to the point that they did the spin-off show, Peacemaker show, and he crushed that too. So I just wanted to make sure that we understood that the DCU hasn't been entirely doom and gloom. There are some good things that came out of it. There's just overwhelmingly more negatives. So that brings me to the crucial question of this is, can we save the DCEU as it exists now? And the answer is no, right? There's just so many problems, and I don't think we can come back from it, right? First of all, it's too far gone, right? If we had tried to turn it around earlier on, after Man of Steel, hell, maybe even as far in as like Suicide Squad, I feel like we could have made some corrections, right? Yes, Batman, Superman still would have been in there, and that would mean that, you know, Lex Luthor kind of sucked, and that Doomsday kind of sucked, and, you know, there were a lot of pieces that had been burnt, but we could have, you know, cut around the bad parts and built a good universe out of it. But we're like, what, 7 or 8 movies deep now, and it's just too far to save it in the continuity that it is. And I know that some people have brought up the idea of using Flashpoint to save the DCEU, but I don't believe that could work, on account of the fact that if you did Flashpoint as it appears in the comics, that would leave you with the same Flash as it was at before Flashpoint, which in this case would be Ezra Miller, which we don't want to do. And yes, you could do Flashpoint and still recast him, but that wouldn't solve the problem either, because much like the people who are saying that they should do Infinite Crisis instead, that still leaves all of the previous films as part of the series. They're not necessarily canon, depending on, you know, your personal viewpoint on that, but there's no arguing that even after an Infinite Crisis or a Flashpoint, when you go and you look at, you know, lists of these are all the DCEU films, the bad ones from before Flashpoint are still going to be on it. When you go and you find a box set for all the DCEU films, those pre-Flashpoint films are still going to be a part of it, right? And even though that seems like such a small thing, it's just this like festering wound at the beginning of this story that just needs to be cut, right? We just need to get a clean cut, maybe apologize for it if we have to, and just completely start over. There's no universe in which we are able to take everything that has happened so far and say, okay, but now from this point on it's going to be good, right? Not while the previous stuff is still part of it, right? So What can we learn from it, though? Right? Like I said, there are things that we can pull out of this, positive and negative, that we can learn from. One of my teachers in high school used to always say, the learning happens in the struggle. And anyone watching this video who had that teacher is probably groaning right now, but she was right. You know what I mean? And so here's some things that we can learn from it. Number one, we need to take time to actually set things up. If we had Batman vs. Superman, but we didn't have to take time out of that movie to do Batman's backstory and explain who Wonder Woman was and do all of that stuff, we probably could have taken all that other time and maybe made it so that we had some understanding of why Lex was the way he was, or why Doomsday was the way that he was, or just spent more time with the characters so that we didn't necessarily mind that so much of that stuff was wrong. You know what I mean? If we take the time to set these things up, it's going to mean that we can save that time in later movies, and that it'll give people more time to empathize and connect with the characters instead of just being like, here's Wonder Woman, she's at a party, right? Like, it's strange. Two, we need to start small and leave room for escalation. We cannot do the death and return of Superman in the first, 4 or 5 films? That's a lot, right? We're killing off Superman in the second movie, but we only just got to know him in the first movie, right? Like, we're still figuring out what the world is like with Superman, and the DC universe as well is still figuring out what it means to be in a world that has Superman. So when he's gone, it's like, oh, well, we just go back to what it was a week ago. Whereas in the comic, and what it was shown as being in the movies afterwards, is that people were acting as if the world was doomed now that he was gone, but he was only there for a couple of months. Like, it just didn't feel right. 3, we need to put actors in roles that actually suit them, right? Casting is a really big deal, and it's something that the MCU has done very well. And it's not just necessarily putting actors in roles that suit them, but also writing those roles to utilize the skill set of those actors, right? So that's a big thing we need to take from them. We need to stop using CG as a crutch and start using it as a tool. There's a reason why when you go and look at old CG, it looks like dog water. But when you go and look at old practical effects, they still look good. And that's because the practical effect is really there. It is real. And the actors can react to it as though it is real because it is. You know what I mean? I mean, it's not really a dinosaur or whatever, but it's a real thing that is there and they can act around. Whereas, I mean, we should have already known this from like the Star Wars prequels, but if you just put a person on a green screen, there's not a whole lot of cues they can take from it to understand what's happening, and that makes for a worse performance. Also, if the CG looks bad, then it's going to immediately take people out of the scene. So, got to learn from that. Also, we need to stay true to the characters, but not be restricted by them. Comic books are extremely convoluted, and there's so many different versions of all of these characters that there's no way that we can do every single thing 100% exactly how it was in the comics, because no matter which version of the comics that you do, there's going to be somebody who's like, well, that's not the version of the character that I know, right? There's no way to please people 100% with it, but as long as we're faithful to the core of what that character is, we can make small changes to what he does or why certain things happen, and people will accept it, because at least they'll still be like, but that's still Superman, that's still Batman, that's still Wonder Woman. They still feel like those characters. They're just doing things slightly different than what happened in the comics, because also we don't want to just tell the exact story that are in the comics, because if we do that, then the people who have read them already know everything that's going to happen. So where's the fun in that? Also, I can't prove that the DCEU didn't know where they were going before they started, but it really felt like it. And so that's why before I even started this first video in this series, I've already scripted out 3 entire phases so that I can pepper in pieces and references to things that are going to happen in the future, and know when and where I need to introduce things, so that it's not a situation where I know I've said it a lot, but like Wonder Woman just shows up at a party because we need her in this movie and we couldn't think of a better way to get her in there, right? It's important to know where you're going before you start trying to get there. And one of the things that the DCEU has proven positively is that we can still do films that are not related to the core canon, like the core timeline, and have it not be confusing to people, right? The DC has done The Batman with Robert Pattinson and has done Joker with Joaquin Phoenix, and nobody was confused by that, right? No one was going like, oh, is this Joker the same as the Jared Leto Joker? They knew that they were separate things and that they were in separate continuities, which is something that is good to know, that that's not something that confuses the mass audience, right? Because that means we can have like our core DCEU canon, but still do things like an Elseworlds comic. We can do a Gotham by Gaslight. We can do a Red Sun Superman, or any number of the other Elseworld comics that are popular, or even new ones that crop up throughout the thing. We can use the same cast and just have them act different to give them a break or a change of pace, or just completely recast it because it's its own thing, right? And that's a lot of fun. That gives some side material so that we aren't all just doing the same thing over and over and over again, right? So that's cool. Something else that I want to bring into this conversation is that there were a lot of DC films before the DCEU, and there are things that we can learn from that as well, right? Number one, we need to avoid stupid voices. The Nolan trilogy, I think most people will say, are some of the best DC movies, and they are correct. That is true. But there's one thing that cannot be said or as a positive, and that's the voices that several characters do, right? Obviously, the Batman voice is so bad that it has still been a meme on like Saturday Night Live and stuff years later, right? Because it was genuinely that bad. And it's the same thing for Bane. And honestly, probably a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this. I would say it's not as bad, but still not good. The Joker voice, I don't think any of them should have been talking the way that they were, right? I think that people on set should have been like, hey, that Batman voice that you're doing sounds really stupid. Can you stop doing that? Speaking of the Nolan movies, avoid dumb poses. Sounds like a very specific thing, and it is. I was rewatching some of these old DC movies in preparation for this, and I was watching Batman Begins specifically, and I couldn't find a picture of it, so I put a similar stupid pose from Batman Superman, where Batman's doing the Grinch thing up in the corner. But in Batman Begins, Christian Bale's Batman goes to visit Gordon at one point, and he's just like perched up on a banister on like a staircase, and it looks very stupid. And I wish I could have found a picture of it, but I couldn't. So you'll have to take my word for it, I guess. But when you put these characters who are already kind of goofy and kind of hard to believe as being in a real world, and you make them do stupid things like pose in weird positions or crawl up into the corner like this, it immediately doesn't feel right. You know what I mean? Like that wouldn't look right if it was a guy in normal street clothes, and it doesn't look any better if he's dressed like a bat. You know what I mean? It's just very strange. Speaking of which, we also need to make the costumes wearable. This is something that we learned in a combination of The Batman with Robert Pattinson and also some of the older Batman movies, where if the actor isn't comfortable and can't move well, it affects their ability to act, right? Pattinson moved better and was able to do more interesting choreography in his fights and all of his scenes because he could physically move and do those things, right? Keaton, I'm sure, could have done better choreography if he wasn't wearing a head-to-toe latex bodysuit that prevented him from bending or turning. You know what I mean? So that's something we need to keep in mind. Also, there's room for camp, but only when appropriate. This is very specific. It's something that I noticed while watching the old Superman movies, is there are certain characters where we don't need to do this super dark, like nitty gritty, like everything's gloomy tone for, right? Specifically with things like Superman, like there's this really great moment in the first Superman movie where Superman saves Lois and he grabs her and he's just like, "Don't worry, I've got you." And she's like, "You've got me, who's got you?" And it's very camp, but it's great. You know, it fits into that universe very well, and it fits the tone of who Superman is. If that same thing had happened in like a Batman movie, it wouldn't necessarily have felt well, or wouldn't have felt right. But you can have some camp with certain characters, like Superman, like Shazam, like the Joker, even, right? You just need to understand that, you know, not every movie has to have the same tone in order for it to be in the same universe. Less is more. This is, again, something that we learned from the Batman, is we don't need all this crazy stuff. You know, we don't need terraforming machines that are destroying the planet. We don't need, you know, Steppenwolf to show up and take on 3 civilizations of people all at the same time. You can have just a serial killer and have that be terrifying, right? That Riddler is a much better villain than anything that has been in the DCEU up to that point, right? He's so much better, and yes, of course, he does escalate it at the end of the movie, but even up until that point, he is already so much more compelling as a villain than anybody else in that universe. So less is more, right? It makes it more believable and more scary. This. I know I've already talked about CG and having it not look good. This is one of the strongest examples of poor CG. We don't need to do this. We don't need to do this. Just put him in a real suit. Like, what was this? I don't know. I didn't have a lot to say about it because it kind of speaks for itself. But that Green Lantern suit was just such a mistake. Anyway, one thing, we can recast when necessary. This is something that I've learned throughout going back through these movies, is you look at the original, I guess, quadrilogy of Batman movies, and they have 3 different people playing Batman, and I wouldn't say it's not confusing, because it is, but it's not the end of the world, right? That is, you know, a bigger recasting than necessarily I would want to do in my films. But if we get into a situation where, like, we have, like they had in those same movies with Harvey Dent, where Billy D. Williams was Harvey Dent in the first of those movies, but by the time it came to the Two-Face movie, you know, Batman Forever, they switched it to Tommy Lee Jones because Billy D. Williams was off doing other stuff, and that was fine. You know, people obviously were aware, like, hey, that's a different guy, but Harvey Dent was such a small role in the previous movie that it didn't really matter, right? So there are times where it is okay to recast if the character is important enough to still have in the movie, even though the actor, for one reason or another, can't be, right? So recasting is okay. The other thing is keep the heroes human, right? If all of the heroes that we're dealing with feel like these, you know, gods among men, you can't empathize with them. You don't understand who they are because you'll never understand what it's like to be like that, right? But if, like in the old Superman movies, you get time to understand them and you get to see, like, oh, here's his mom, here's his relationship with Lois, you know, these human moments, it helps to keep that character grounded. And of course, we can't talk about creating a superhero universe without talking about the MCU, right? This is quite possibly the only example of somebody doing this shared universe thing and having it work. And so there's, of course, so much that we can learn from what they've done, right? First of all, kind of like what I was saying a minute ago, give the characters time out of their costumes so that we can get to know them as people. Yes, we love Captain America, we love Iron Man, we love all of these characters as their heroes, but we empathize with them as human beings because we see them interacting with each other as people, right? We see them hanging out outside of their costumes. You know, we see Captain America just doing laundry at his apartment and meeting Sharon there, right? Or like we see Tony just hanging out at his house with Pepper, right? Like these are very important human moments that show us not just who these people are when they're heroes, but who they are as people. And it helps us understand not only who they are, but their relationships with each other, right? So it's very important. Another thing we can learn from them is that we can balance the drama with humor. This really helps people sit through movies, right? If you make a 3-hour movie and it's just a constant beatdown, people aren't going to want to rewatch it. You know what I mean? It's just, it becomes kind of a drag to go back and sit through that again, or even to sit through it the first time, right? And now I do think the MCU goes too far in times where they will undercut serious moments with a joke, and we don't want to do that. But every now and then, I think it's very important to have some kind of levity, right? I think it's important just to keep people in the seat and keep them happy. Secondly, and hopefully, Mr. Gunn, you are the solution to this problem, but we need to have a Feige, right? We need to have a unifying voice who looks over everything and says, this is good, this is not, right? Somebody who keeps track of the canon and can point out things that are wrong, where it's like, hey, this character is like this here, but he's different over here, right? And just can keep track of what everything is so that it feels like a shared universe, even though there's so many different people working on it. Something that I think is kind of a sleeper success for the MCU, at least up until Phase 4, was that it happened in real time, right? What that does is, so to explain it, in the MCU, if a movie, up until the Infinity War, the snap, right? Up until that moment, if a movie came out in 2015, then that movie took place in 2015, with exception, obviously, like Captain America was back in, the World War time, and Ms. Marvel was in the 90s, or Captain Marvel, rather, was in the 90s. So, there's an exception to the rule, but for the most part, if a movie came out in a year, it took place in that year. And what that does is that without having to know the timeline or care about it in that way, the audience feels the time that has passed between those movies, because it's the same time that has passed for the viewer between those movies. So if Captain America in his third movie is like, oh, but that was so long ago, it was back in my first movie, the audience knows how long that is without even really having to think about it, because they can remember how long ago it was for them when that movie came out. And so it helps them. It basically is the closest thing that the audience can get to being a part of the movie, to being in the world of the movie. And I think that's really helpful. Again, I think we've talked about this a little bit, but good setup yields great payoff. This moment from Endgame is probably one of my favorite moments in cinematic history. But this moment means nothing if it happens in film 2. You know what I mean? Right? If this was the second movie in the MCU, none of this would have meant anything, because we wouldn't know what a big deal it is that Captain America is wielding Mjolnir. We wouldn't know the running gag of him trying to say Avengers Assemble and how powerful that moment is, or how every single person who shows up in that scene is somebody who we know and we remember. Even the extras were like, those are guys from Wakanda, those are Ravagers, those are this, right? We instinctively know because we have seen all of these movies, and that leads to a level of payoff that cannot happen otherwise, right? This is something that we need to be trying to build towards in our DCEU. And I'm not saying we need to do this exact moment where like, oh, everyone's here and we're going to fight the big bad, but like something like this, you know what I mean? But the MCU has also made a lot of mistakes, and we can learn from those as well. First of all, we're not going to kill all of our villains. Now, this is something that's already a difference between Marvel Comics and DC Comics, in that a lot of DC heroes don't kill their villains, and Marvel ones do. The problem with doing that, with killing off so many of your villains, is that means once you get to like the situation that we're seeing in Marvel's Phase 4 right now, is you're kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel when it comes to villains, and you're like, oh, what if the Wrecking Crew was in She-Hulk, right? Or like, what if we had the main villain of that show be just a bunch of incels? Like, that's, you know what I mean? Like, if we stop taking toys out of the toy chest, then we still have those toys to use later. You just have to put them back when you're done with them. You know what I mean? If you look at the number of villains who have survived their debut movies in the MCU, it is shockingly short of a list, right? Number two, and this is the last time I promise that I'll bring up CG, but hey, pay your CG artists. Like, if they're not happy, then you get some really bad work, right? And this is something that has become more and more of a problem with Marvel lately, where, like, I mean, like this moment above me with the skeleton from Miss Marvel, but there's so many examples of this not working out for them. There's the floating head boy from Love and Thunder. There's a lot of the scenes with She-Hulk. You know, it's just, again, if you're going to use CG, make sure it looks right. And if the number one way to make that happen is to have CG artists who come into work and enjoy what they're doing and don't hate their lives, that's an easy solution. Just treat them well and pay them what they deserve, right? Another big problem that people rightfully levy at the MCU movies is they're very formulaic. They have that same tone in almost every single movie, where it's we're gonna have drama, but every time there's drama, you can almost count from 3 and there will be a joke immediately afterwards, right? Also, there's the formulaic issue of so many of the villains having the same powers, right? Like, Captain America fights Red Skull, who also used the superhero serum, or the super soldier serum, right? Or like Ant-Man fights Yellow Jacket, or like all of these things. There's so many examples of this, and it gets old, right? It gets old to see, oh, hey, this new guy got introduced and he has this power. I wonder who he's going to fight. Oh, a guy with the same power. Cool, lame. This is similar to my first point here, but we should avoid killing off key characters if we don't have a suitable replacement for them, right? This is something that's happening in Marvel's Phase 4 right now, where, spoilers, I guess, but Captain America, Tony Stark, and T'Challa are all dead right now. And while we do have literal replacements for them, by which I mean that we have a new Captain America in Falcon, we're getting a new Iron Man with Riri Williams, Ironheart, and we're getting a new Black Panther, presumably Shuri. That movie will probably be out by the time that this video comes out, but at the time I haven't watched it yet, but I assume it's Shuri. But while we will have people to take up those mantles in universe, we need to have people who can hold up the brand on the level that those people did. And I suspect that what Marvel's going to do is end up leaning on Spider-Man for that, although it seems kind of touch and go because they don't really own Spider-Man right now. But if he can hold it up at least for long enough for them to get the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, and they're going to be fine. But at the moment, they're in a weird situation where the next phase or two are going to feel very lackluster in comparison, just because we don't have that same level of, like, star power, I guess. So that's problematic, and there's a couple ways that we can avoid that, right? One of them is if we start peppering in small characters before we run out of the big ones, then we can still have these situations where we can still be introducing characters that people already know and care about when we get to Phase 4 and 5, right? Obviously, Marvel's kind of doing that probably on accident, just because they didn't own the Fantastic Four and X-Men before now. But, you know, I think one of the bigger problems with Phase 4 has been that a lot of the characters that they're introducing, with maybe the exception of She-Hulk, have been ones that people don't really know, right? I know 2 people who have read Moon Knight comics, right? And only one of them liked it. You know, Shang-Chi, that movie turned out to be really good, but people didn't know about him beforehand. And so that's fine, right? I think we saw with Guardians that you can introduce heroes that people don't really know, but if it's back to back to back, then people start to lose interest because there's not that level of engagement for them, right? Whereas now the next Guardians movie is going to be thought of as this huge thing, even though when the first one came out, everyone was like, who are these people? And so if we pepper the smaller characters in early, by the time we need them to be big characters, they'll already be big characters. You see what I'm saying? The other thing is, we need to hire actors who can play long term and know that they're going to be in that role long term, right? I'm talking about characters, you know, maybe we have to cast a little bit younger so that they can spend a good amount of time in those shoes, because when we're hiring, especially for big positions, I'm talking Batman, Wonder Woman, Superman, right? Like big positions, especially. When we hire those people, they need to understand that like if you get hired on as Batman in this universe, you're going to be Batman for 15 to 20 years, right? And I know that sounds like a really long time, and that's because it is a really long time. But keep in mind, of course, that even though they are Batman for that whole amount of time, they're not going to be in a movie every single year. They're going to be filming, maybe every other year, every third year. So there'll be plenty of time in between for them to go and do side projects or write a book or whatever they want to do, as long as they understand that when we need them to be Batman, they are our Batman, right? I can't have this situation where we get 3 phases in and then, Captain America wants to go do other things, or Tony Stark wants to go and do other things, and so we have to kill that character off. Even if it comes down to that point, maybe we have to make deals where it's like, okay, we're not going to kill your character off, but we're going to very severely limit his appearances, right? We'll make it so that Captain America only shows up in like one movie a phase, and that'll give them time to go off and do their other things and then come back when we need them, right? But for us to just completely write off major characters like that isn't going to work. It really dramatically will affect the longevity of our universe. This is a nitpick, but it's something that is specifically irritating me right now, is if we're going to show things in credit scenes, we need to make sure that they are things that are going to be happening soon. Because, like, Guardians 3 is coming out soon, right? Or soon-ish. And it's going to finally feature Adam Warlock, who they started teasing in movies, in credit scenes after movies, 7 years ago. And so that makes me worried about other characters who have shown up in credit scenes. People like Eros or Hercules, right? Like, these are characters who, when are we going to see them again? Are they going to be in Secret Wars? Is it going to be a decade before this person shows up again? Is that actor even going to still want to be that role by the time that he's actually able to show up for it? Don't show things that are so far in advance that we can't 100% guarantee that it's still going to be the way that we thought it was going to be at the time we teased it, right? Don't overpromise things that you aren't 100% confident you can deliver. This is another one that's been very irritating to me lately, which is we need to make sure that the directors and writers actually know the characters that they're writing for, right? This is something that has been especially prevalent in situations like, I hate to call her out, but Jessica Gao, right? I don't think she did a bad job with She-Hulk, but she did not understand who that character was, right? The fact that she was tapped to write a comedic courtroom show and did not know how to write a courtroom show, and frankly wasn't that funny, is problematic, right? If you make a courtroom show that has very little courtroom action and a comedy that is not funny, then you have failed. And of course, comedy is subjective, so there's probably plenty of people who are going, "Oh no, Daniel, that movie or that show was hilarious," and like, I'm glad you thought so. I didn't, and it seems like most people didn't. So I would say it still, in general, was kind of a failure. And I kind of liked that show. Like, I don't even think it was a bad show, but it wasn't a great representation of She-Hulk, and probably the best version, or the best example of directors and writers not understanding the characters that they're writing for is Taika Waititi, who, this is not a joke, has come out and said that before writing Thor Ragnarok, he read like half of one comic of Thor, said, "I'm not doing that," and then threw it away. And it's just incredibly disrespectful, and if someone does that, then they're not writing that movie. Right? I'm sorry, if they can't be respectful to the characters, then they are not going to be in charge of that character. Right? And speaking of respecting things, they need to also respect the previous films, even the ones that they didn't direct. Right? This is something that has been a big problem for the MCU, in my opinion, for honestly a long time, but it's been snowballing and getting worse and worse. Things like how like, they killed off Loki, and then they were like, "Oh no, we don't have Loki," so they had to come up with this contrivance of time travel to get that actor back in because he was really popular. You know what I mean? Or like how at the end of Iron Man 3, Tony blows up all of his suits, which is this really like kind of touching moment. It's honestly, in my opinion, one of the better moments of that movie, but it ends up meaning nothing because in the next movie that he's in, he just has a ton of suits again. Like, we don't talk about the fact that that thing just happened. Like, I don't even think it's mentioned, right? Or again, Taika Waititi with his Thor franchise, when he took over, yes, Dark World was not a good movie, but it had some interesting things coming out of it where Loki was pretending to be Odin and was like the fake king of Asgard, and Thor had left and he was saying, I'm gonna go find the other Infinity Stones. And then Taika Waititi took over, and within 5 minutes of the start of that movie, Thor shows back up to Asgard, is like, didn't find him, bummer, and then like, hey, also that's Loki, and just like completely threw out all of those very interesting potential plot points. And that's a real bummer, right? It's not cool. Also, he didn't even just do that to like disrespect the previous movies, which like I understand that they weren't popular movies, but they were still part of the franchise. Like, respect them as having existed. But he also, on top of that, completely just murdered the Warriors 3 and then made fun of the fact that he murdered the Warriors 3 in his next movie, where he's like, and she killed that guy and this guy and that guy, like they didn't matter, which is the only reason they didn't matter is because he didn't do anything with them and instead chose to kill them, which it irritates me. And there's other things that irritate me that are in that same vein, where it's like, you know, Spider-Man was introduced fighting on the side of Tony during Civil War, despite the fact that I'm relatively confident he's like the only person on that tarmac who had a secret identity. So he's fighting for Tony to force everyone to register as a superhuman, even though he's the only one who would have to fill that paperwork out himself. Because everyone else, you know, the government would be like, yep, that's Wanda Maximoff. Yeah, that's Natasha Romanoff. Like we know. Everyone else is already like a known person. They go by their real name. Spider-Man is the only. So why is he on Tony's side? I understand he's on Tony's side in the comics, and that's fine because he's an adult in that and is making the choice for himself. But then we get to the Spider-Man movies, and he's keeping his secret identity, even though he apparently thought that having secret identities was a bad thing. And then at the end of his second movie, his secret identity gets revealed, and he freaks out about it and spends his entire third movie rewriting the timeline so that his identity didn't get revealed. And it's like, it just feels very inconsistent. It's very strange. But probably the most irritating version of this to me is with WandaVision. I love the WandaVision show. It's amazing, right? It's one of the best written, I think, pieces in the MCU. It's one of the most successful and unique aspects that the MCU has ever done, right? So I'm taking nothing away from the show itself, right? If you don't know, the general plot of it is that after Wanda loses Vision, who she's in love with, she kind of loses it, right? She accidentally she creates this picturesque like Stepford town to relive like sitcoms wherein her husband is still alive and she has these two kids, but she doesn't realize that she has done that by by imprisoning a town and brainwashing its inhabitants to play the roles inside this sitcom, right? And she has to come to terms with the fact that like what she's doing is wrong, and she has to grow to give up these kids who aren't real, and has to come to terms with the fact that her husband is dead, right? And it's this very touching moment. It's probably the best line in the MCU at all, when Vision says, you know, she's talking about how much she's going to miss him after she drops the spell, and Vision says, you know, what is grief but love persevering? And it's such a powerful moment and such a powerful line. And yes, the ending of that show got a little stupid, where they were having a very Marvel fight between her and Agatha, and you know, there's that one really stupid line where Photon says like, they'll never know what you sacrificed for them. And it's like, they don't care what you sacrificed for them. you imprison them for like months. But up until that point, it was this really great thing where it was very similar to a Superman story actually called For the Man Who Has Everything. And it was great and I think very well done. But then in the very next appearance of Wanda, they just do the same story arc again. They just completely ignore the fact that she's grown and learned to move on, or at least to some degree move on, because in the next movie she's like, now I know I felt bad when I imprisoned a town of people, but actually I'm gonna go universe jumping and like causing incursions which destroys entire universes, so that I can go and find a version of myself and I guess kill her and kidnap her kids to be my kids. And it's wild. I do not understand it. Surely there has to be somewhere in the universe where the kids exist and she's dead or something and she could have gone there instead. There's 100 different ways you could have written that would have worked better. But instead they decided to just completely throw out the character growth that she had in her own television show and just do it again. And it was awful. And I really didn't like it. And I've gone on a rant here, but I hope you understand that basically all I'm saying is we need to keep track of where characters are, not just literally, but also emotionally, and respect that and continue to grow characters as they go in ways that make sense. And the last thing we can learn from the MCU is that if we're going to do time travel and multiverse stuff, we need to be consistent and we need to tell it in a way that is digestible. One of the number one things that people are falling off the MCU right now in Phase 4 is because of how convoluted all of this nonsense has become. They've introduced like 3 different rule sets for time travel between, Endgame and Ms. Marvel and Loki, and I'm sure something else, but and it's very confusing as to like what's an alternate timeline and what's a different dimension and what's the quantum realm and what's this and what's that, and like none of these questions have been answered well or explained well. And it's not the most important thing. A lot of people will still go in and just enjoy the movie for what it is without having to understand how things work, and I understand that. But if you don't understand how something works, it makes it that much harder to engage with and understand what's happening in that movie. And so it's that much easier for you to not be invested and not continue to watch that series because you don't really know what's happening, and so you don't really like it, right? So if we're going to do those things, which we're going to avoid for as long as possible, we need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that is digestible and understandable for people. So here's what I'm going to do, just to summarize the very long conversation that we've just had. I'm going to create a brand new interconnected DCEU. I'm going to take my time to properly set up the events and characters before they happen so that when they do happen or when characters appear and do things, it will feel earned and feel better. We're going to learn who characters are both on and off the job so that we can better engage with and empathize with these characters. We're going to stay faithful to those characters without being restricted by the very long and convoluted histories that many of them have had in the comics. We're going to learn from the mistakes of others in order to try our best to avoid as many of those previous mistakes as we can. And we're going to balance what people want to see with what they don't know so that we can do things like introduce something like a Guardians early and have it become a big thing by the time we need it to be big. We're going to understand that different films can and should feel different. A Superman movie should not feel the same as a Batman movie. Even though they exist in the same universe, they don't have to have the same tone. And here's something else. Batman is going to be the key to this universe, right? Because there are so many things that we cannot do without properly setting them up, and we have to have Batman in order to set so many of these things up, right? Teen Titans cannot exist without a Robin to lead them. The Suicide Squad, most of the members are Batman villains. Nightwing and Grayson, obviously, and Batgirl for that matter. If we're going to do spin-off series for them, they're going to have to start in something else Batman related. Same thing with Birds of Prey, which are the female Bat family basically doing things, even though that's not what it was in the existing DCEU for whatever reason. They just kind of took the name of Birds of Prey when what they really meant was Gotham City Sirens, another thing that we need Batman in order to do because it's several female Batman villains coming together to do things. So we need to have Batman. So Batman is going to be a touchstone, a cornerstone for this universe, because there are so many things that cannot happen without first setting up him and his universe. So let's get into phase one. Don't worry, we're not going to go too much longer. Each of the individual films will be their own videos, but I just want to explain what my plan for phase one is before we get there. First, we need to introduce the heroes who will become the Justice League before they are the Justice League, so that when we get there, we don't have to spend time in that movie explaining who all these people are. We need to introduce the DC universe, not the audience, but the universe itself, to the idea of superheroes, because the overarching theme of phase one is going to be transitioning a world like our own into a comic book world, right? And here's how we're going to do it. Phase one will consist of 8 projects, the first of which will be the most grounded, the most like our real world, and it will be Gotham Central: The Long Halloween. This is going to be a 9-episode television program that will focus on the officers of the GCPD as they tackle the events of the Long Halloween. Then, the next thing we're going to do is go straight into Batman with Batman Black Mask. Black Mask is a great villain, even though he's not been represented well in basically any other form of media, and I'm hoping to finally do him justice. And he's also not a villain that is particularly, strange, right? It's not a Mr. Freeze or a Poison Ivy or something that takes a lot of explaining. He's just a person he's basically just a mobster plus, you know what I mean? So it's a good place to start a universe. Also Batman, because he's the most grounded of the people who we're going to be doing in this universe, or at least in phase one. And then we'll do The Flash, specifically The Flash Rogue. So this is going to be a film focusing on the beginning of what will become The Flash's Rogues Gallery. It'll be the first film to include a superpower, because while that seems like a big step up in terms of, groundedness from Batman, at the end of the day, his superpower is basically just that he goes fast, and that's a very easy power to wrap your head around. Fourth, we're going to do Wonder Woman: Trial of the Gods. This is, again, a pretty big step up, because we're going from just a guy who runs fast to like an Amazon war goddess. But we need to get her in there, and I think this is the best spot for it. This is going to be a movie that introduces Wonder Woman as the character who she actually is supposed to be, not this bumbling idiot from the DCEU. And it's going to take place entirely on Themyscira. Then we'll have our second Batman film, Batman: Pain and Prejudice, a Batman film focusing on the Penguin and his operations. This is to bring it back down to a more understandable, grounded thing after the high of what Wonder Woman is undoubtedly going to be. But after that, we'll go straight into Hawkman. If there's one thing that I've learned from having watched Black Adam, is that Hawkman has potential. He, in the comic books, is rather convoluted, and not a lot of people particularly know who he is or care about him, but that's why I think this is a perfect place to put him in, so that people get a chance to really care about him. After that, we're going to go into Superman: Man of Tomorrow, which will be obviously Superman's origin story, and his introduction to this universe. He's, the most powerful member of the Justice League in a lot of ways, so he's the least grounded of the movies here, but we need to get him in before we do Justice League Invasion, the final film of phase one, which will feature maybe I shouldn't spoil who the villains of those are, but this is my phase one, and I cannot wait to get into it with you guys, but that's a conversation for a different time. So please let me know what you thought about all of this. I understand it was a lot of talking and a lot of thinking, but let me know what you think about my plans going forward. And Mr. Gunn, I would love to hear what you thought about it. Anything that you want to change about this plan would be taken, of course, with the utmost seriousness. And I wouldn't mind if you would leave a comment telling me what you thought on this video. Maybe even subscribe to the channel and share it with a friend. And until next time, I'll see you around.